It was less than 72 hours after I published my last piece that the White House and President Biden and congressional leadership pressured Congress to, in accordance with the Railway Labor Act, bring an end to the dispute between the carriers and the unions. The calls for action from the White House came merely 2 weeks before the December 9th deadline for potential strike action from the unions. 4 of the 12 unions, most notably the Smart Transportation Division, voted to reject the tentative agreement, thereby sending both the carriers and the unions back to the negotiating table, all while Congress still had the ability to prevent a work stoppage. For some more context, as soon as the Smart Transportation Division results came out, we saw a barrage of news stories coming from the mainstream media covering the rail situation. We saw story after story discussing how there was an impending rail strike and how it was necessary for Congress to step in. If there was one metric that stood out during that time period, it was $2 billion a day. That was the projected cost per day that a rail strike would have on the American economy. The issue, however, is that this metric was provided by the Association of American Railroads. To recap, the Association of American Railroads is a lobbying firm that serves the interests of the railroads. The Association of American Railroads donates to various politicians, but they also serve the interests of the railroads by publishing various articles as well as having their representatives make media appearances. We saw these appearances on mainstream news outlets along with, in opposition to the railroads, various union leaders such as Jeremy Ferguson of Smart Transportation Division. So, with the backdrop of all of the news coverage, Congress faced calls not just from various politicians but various business groups to act in order to prevent a work stoppage. The White House called for the tentative agreement to be enacted by Congress. This was the agreement that union and carrier negotiators came to back in September. The tentative agreement gave a 24% increase over 5 years, including back pay, to the workers represented by the unions. It also gave 1 paid day off per year along with 3 unpaid sick days, although there were various stipulations as to how those days could be used. 8 of the 12 unions voted to ratify the agreement, and 4 of the 12 unions, primarily Smart Transportation Division, voted to reject the agreement. The White House stated that they wanted action to come as soon as possible. They wanted House Joint Resolution 100, which was essentially the tentative agreement, to be enacted with no strings attached. However, we would eventually have amendments from both Republicans and Democrats. Progressive Democrats, in their fight for rail workers, added the amendment that would give 7 paid sick days to rail workers. Progressives managed to introduce Joint Resolution 119, which served as an amendment to Joint Resolution 100 to give rail workers 7 paid sick days a year. This led us to the proceedings in the U.S. House of Representatives. I'm going to include some of the debate that took place on the floor of the House of Representatives. Do keep in mind some of the Association of American Railroad propaganda coming from the Republican speaker.
Add to a 40-year high inflation that we're already seeing. It would lead to higher energy costs as winter weather raises energy demand, and it's going to disrupt global food supplies. The estimates are that America's economic output could decline by $2 billion a day. For these reasons, organizations representing just about every industry in the economy have called on Congress to avoid a crippling rail strike. And it shouldn't have, it never should have come to this.
My friend from the other side of the aisle continues to mention how wonderful this package is. And it was fairly generous. It was right. They hadn't had a deal in 3 years, so 24% sounds like a great increase, but over 3 years, it is divided by 3, it's 8%, which is a relatively fair increase. So I think that, let's deal with the issues at hand, not make this about bashing the president, and do the work that we need to do. The railroads have said that workers already have sick time. Is that true? Well, let me answer that. It is not true unless what the railroads want you to believe is that when people get sick, they should use their vacation time. Their vacation time for sick days. Now, I'm not sure how on the other side of the aisle their offices are operated, but I thought we're all one Congress, so it's done in the same manner. All my staff has sick days. I believe most of the people that work for this body have sick days. I don't know if they don't have sick days on the other side. I would think that would be reprehensible, but that we're fighting for people not to have what we have is unfortunate and unjust. And so we're just trying to do the right thing for the country and for these workers that have not been able to get the railroads, who have had profits out of the stratosphere in the last decade, to get them to do the one thing that the labor unions asked. They didn't ask for the large raise, the benefits, which are all good. They wanted to deal with sick pay, and the railroads refused to do it.
While Sam Graves and Donald Payne led their respective caucuses in debate, the most memorable speech on the floor of the House that day came from Sheila Jackson Lee of Houston.
I'm on the floor today because I have a heart, and I hope that I will be joining those who will be deliberating very seriously about this legislation. First, however, I want to thank Mr. DeFazio for his leadership on the Transportation Committee and engagement. But I also want to thank my dear, dear friend, Congressman Don Payne, whose vision and commitment and big heart has literally put us in a place where the hearts can control our minds. How indecent is it to have companies who refuse to negotiate with our rail unions, specifically our rail unions? Because I know we have many letters from our suppliers. They don't want to strike. I don't want anything to impact negatively on America or my city of Houston. But I must challenge what we are trying to do with respect to the rail companies. I'm standing with the unions, my locals and my nationals. And the reason is I think we should put into the record BNSF Railway, $23.3 billion in revenue. Union Pacific Railroad, $21.8 billion in revenue. Ownership of BNSF, 46% owned by Wall Street. CXX, 35% owned by Wall Street. Union Pacific, 34%. Kansas City Southern, 33%. Norfolk Southern, 32%. Is there any heart in it being only about dollars? I think it is important that there be a 24% pay raise, bonuses, no changes in co-pays and allowance of time off for routine procedures. But how indecent it is that they would not sit down and provide sick days in the most dangerous professions. Houston is the crossroads starting from the western frontier days of railroads. We have tracks everywhere. They are an inconvenience for our community, no matter where you live, but predominantly in minority communities. They cause ambulances to stop. They injure and they cause school children to have to cross tracks. Madam Speaker, they contaminate our neighborhoods. I know you're on energy and commerce. It is unbelievable, and they won't clean it up. From the EPA to every place we've gone, and people are suffering from cancer. But I want to do the right thing today, and I cannot imagine Con Res 119 is what I'm standing on, because it does not make sense to not provide people with sick days. Paid sick leave for employees is a bare necessity, which I believe should be extended into paid time off for family medical leave as well. But paid time off for sick leave is a top priority for the rail workers, especially when their jobs expose them to risks such as toxic dangers in the rail yards and dangers on the train as well. It is ironic that the railroads resist providing flexibility to their workers' schedule to provide these sick days. Every company that is decent in America should run toward giving merely sick days, mere 7 sick days. And so I rise to support both my community fighting against contamination, and I rise to support this underlying legislation. I hope the White House will take my call, because I will be trying to determine how this will go forward.
Democrats and Republicans were in agreement that a rail strike would bring devastating consequences to the American economy. However, as you saw in the House debate, Republicans were obsessed with pinning all the blame possible on Biden, even to the point where they were mixing up the tentative agreement and the Presidential Emergency Board recommendations.
And in the misinformation that's being proliferated here about the sick days, why is there no mention of the actual sick days in the PEB, the number of sick days that we're adding to? In fact, we came to a resolution, myself and soon-to-be Chairman Graves, that codified the PEB recommendation, the 24% pay raise, 24%. Let's keep in mind that we are in a recession. I'd like for us all to get a 24% raise. But we codified a 24% raise, 14% of which would take effect immediately, the balance which would take place over the next 4 years, $5,000 bonus. 8 of the unions of the 12 agreed. That was the PEB recommendation.
As evidenced by their arguments on the House floor, it was clear that Republicans were unaware of the bad faith negotiating being done by the railroads. After Joint Resolution 119 passed the committee vote, it was time for both Joint Resolution 100 and Joint Resolution 119 to be voted on by the entire House of Representatives. To start off, the House of Representatives overwhelmingly voted in favor of Joint Resolution 100, that being the tentative agreement. It was no surprise that Joint Resolution 100 passed the House, but Joint Resolution 119 faced a much more uncertain future. Despite this, Joint Resolution 119 passed the House by means of party line voting. Democrats voted unanimously to approve the measure, while Republicans, with the exception of 3 representatives, voted to reject the motion. This pitched both resolutions to the United States Senate, where, as a result of the 50-50 split between the Republican and Democrat caucuses, either bill would need 60 votes in order to pass. The Senate provided another wrinkle to the issue when Dan Sullivan of Alaska motioned for a 60-day cool-off period, effectively maintaining the status quo for 60 days, preventing any work stoppage. This ultimately gave the Senate 3 bills to vote on: the 60-day cooling-off period, the 7 days of paid sick leave, and the tentative agreement. Before any votes took place in the Senate, however, we had a speech from Senator Bernie Sanders.
And it turns out that when we talk about the extraordinary level of corporate greed in America, there is no better example of that than what is taking place in the rail industry today. They are the purest example of why the American people are so angry at what's taking place in our economy. So if you look at the rail industry today, what you will understand is that this industry has seen huge record-breaking profits in recent years. Huge profits. In fact, in the first 3 quarters, not a whole year, 3 quarters of this year, the rail industry made a record-breaking $21 billion in profit. Further, they have so much money, profits are so high, that the industry spent over $25 billion this year not to improve rail safety, not to address the supply chain crisis, but to buy back its own stock and hand out huge dividends to its wealthy stockholders. In fact, since 2010, and I hope every member of Congress hears this, the rail industry has spent over $183 billion on stock buybacks and dividends. And on top of all of that, the CEOs of many of these railroad companies are enjoying huge compensation packages. So while workers struggle, Last year, the CEO of CSX made over $20 million in total compensation. The CEO of Union Pacific and Norfolk Southern made over $14 million each in total compensation. In other words, within the rail industry, corporate profits are soaring and CEOs are making incredibly large compensation packages. But in the midst of all of that, it is fair to ask what is going on for workers. Profits record-breaking, CEOs tens of millions of dollars a year in compensation. What's going on for the workers in the rail industry? And the reality is that the key issue in the rail dispute that we are dealing with right now, votes taking place as we speak in the House, is not about salary. It's not about how much money workers there are earning. The key issue is the working conditions in the rail industry, which are absolutely unacceptable and literally beyond belief. Right now, if you work in the freight rail industry, and this is a job in the rail industry, this is really hard work, dangerous work. It's work that takes place when it's 20 below zero. If you are a worker in the rail freight industry, you are entitled to a grand total of 0 sick days. Let me repeat that. You are entitled to a grand total of 0 sick days. Now, as a nation, industry after industry, government after government, here in Congress, our people get sick. They have the right to take time off. It's humane. Nobody, not the most conservative member of this institution, would say to a worker, oh, you got COVID, you're fired. It would be unthinkable. And yet, what this means, the policy in the rail industry means, is if you get sick, if your child gets sick, if your spouse gets sick, and you need to take time off of work, not only will you not get paid, you actually will get reprimanded and could get fired. And that absurd, inhumane situation is precisely what is taking place today in the rail industry.
The first vote on the docket was the Sullivan Amendment vote. It was the 60-day cooling off period extension, which also allowed for the carriers and the unions to continue negotiating. With little to no support, however, the Sullivan Amendment failed the Senate, getting nowhere near the necessary 60 votes. In a stunning twist, the next vote to take place was on the 7 days of paid sick leave. Despite support from a handful of Republicans, however, Joint Resolution 119 failed to meet the 60 votes necessary in the Senate. Lastly, there was the vote for the tentative agreement itself, Joint Resolution 100. 80 senators voted in favor of the tentative agreement, exceeding the 60-vote approval threshold, while 15 senators, most notably Senator Bernie Sanders, voted to reject the tentative agreement. What is more frustrating is less than a week after the Senate votes, the Democrats secured 51 seats in the upcoming Senate, which would have had the ability to end any filibuster and approve any measure with a simple majority, not the 60-vote threshold. Democrats could have used this to their advantage. Theoretically, they could have approved the Sullivan Amendment, adding an additional 60 days of the status quo, and thereby pitching the issue to the next Congress. In a Senate where they held 51 seats, the Democrats could have ended any Republican filibuster, and by means of those 51 seats, they could have passed a measure with a simple majority instead of the 60-vote threshold. Getting back to the tentative agreement, President Biden signed the tentative agreement into law a day after the Senate approved it. This was met with the overwhelming frustration of railroad workers across the country. While the tentative agreement included 3 days of unpaid sick leave, it did not adequately address the fundamental quality of life issues that railroaders have been bringing forward for years. Even more frustrating is how, once again, the federal government was complicit in the oppression of rail workers. The Railway Labor Act gives Congress the ability to intervene in a labor dispute. However, they are not required to intervene in a labor dispute. This was actually addressed in the House of Representatives during debate. Take a listen.
Makes a mockery of this institution. And by the way, the authority that we have to deal with this doesn't mandate that we deal with it. It just says we have the authority. And by the way, that authority was given in 1926, almost 100 years ago. What a colossal failure on the part of the president and on the part of the speaker that we have to be here at all, wasting valuable time of this body that we could be doing so many more important things for our people in this country than having to deal with this hostage situation at a time when our economy cannot sustain it.
There is an elephant in the room to discuss. How much blame does Joe Biden have for what occurred? All I will say is that it is incredibly frustrating and disappointing to see the president completely cave to corporate fear-mongering. That fear-mongering is what we were relentlessly subjected to, with statistics such as $2 billion a day lost and 750,000 jobs lost. However, certain individuals did adequately address the rampant corporate greed that had been causing issues for rail labor and rail customers. While the dispute is over, like I said in my previous piece, the railroads still have fundamental issues. Despite their self-reporting, the railroads are still seeing massive slowdowns and are still seeing labor issues. The railroads are still experiencing self-inflicted labor shortages, and given what we have heard from railroad executives, it seems as though they are still oblivious to the real issues.
Furlough people, if you furlough 375, 200 of them might not come back. And what's that about?
Yeah,
Where'd they go?
The labor force participation market right now or the rate is pretty low. And so we're taking another view of that as well. And so during an economic weakness, we're going to train our employees because we feel like employees are an investment in our service and an investment in our future. So
But these people, you say yourself that less than half of them came back. I mean, what is that?
Found other jobs. We are going to invest over the long term in our workforce, and that is my personal commitment.
The mainstream media may say that the crisis has been averted, but for railroad workers, the crisis is ongoing, and the crisis will only worsen. It's true that the labor dispute brought national attention to the railroads, but the problems are ongoing and they are exacerbated by the railroad business practices. And speaking of exacerbating problems, the railroads are still pushing for one-man crews. Just look at the Union Pacific expediter position. I appreciate the politicians who have at least focused on the corporate greed that has fueled the railroad dysfunction and the labor abuse that has taken place. However, the railroad executives still have not been held accountable for what they have done to the railroads in this country. I can also appreciate the back pay that is part of this deal and will be going out to railroad workers. I imagine that it was a driving force behind many of the yes votes that were in those elections to ratify the tentative agreement. In conclusion, while we have seen a national and international rail labor movement this year, there is still a significant amount of work that is to be done. The railroads will begin to see their revenue and profits decrease as a result of their poor decisions and labor abuse. We as a nation are fully capable of protecting our own economy and our own national railroad apparatus, but that will only be accomplished when we respect the sacrifices made by rail labor. Sadly, until we collectively do that as a nation, our economy and our workers will suffer. The railroads are once again trying to reduce the size of operating crews to just one person on board the trains. Not only would one-man crews slow down the national freight railroad network, they would also endanger the communities these railroads run through. We as a nation cannot afford to continually be held hostage by railroad executives, and we as a nation cannot afford to let our politicians simply play to their needs. We as a nation cannot afford to forget what has been perpetrated against rail labor this year, and we cannot allow our own politicians to repeatedly bail out the callous decisions of railroad executives.